Yeah, prerequisites for deploying Citrix DaaS on Microsoft Azure. So, so what are the prerequisites for let's say I'm a customer. I'm a very new customer. I don't have any on-premise infrastructure for Citrix. So now like my goal is to deploy everything is in the cloud, either Citrix cloud or Azure cloud for the hosting, etc. So what are the prerequisites? So the first thing is design and build a Azure landing zone. So if many of you might have heard landing zone so many times, right? So what is landing zone? So in order to give a quick brief idea what is landing zone, for example, consider you are building a home, okay? So in order to build a home, you need to have a plan, right? Like let's say the hall should be in the front facing and the kitchen should be either in the front or it will be in the back side. It cannot be in the first floor or second floor, right? The kitchen. Similarly, the washrooms and all those things. So there is a principle, right, to build a home. Like what, like the car park, it should be in the underground or it should be in the front side. It should not be in the 10th floor or something like that, or 8th floor. I'm just giving the idea that to build a home, you need to have some principles. So you need to have some plans, right? So accordingly, you can, if you build according to the plan, then it will be it is going to succeed. Otherwise, it will be a failed plan. For example, let's say if you build your kitchen in third floor or the second floor, then you will not have a convenient, like each time you have to go for anything you have to prepare, etc. Right? So because most of the time you will be in the ground floor. So that's where Azure Landing Zone, it is nothing but a set of principles you have to follow when you are deploying a highly scalable infrastructure in Azure. So for example, let's say if you wanted to build Citrix workload on Microsoft Azure, then first you need to define a landing zone. Most of the companies will already have a landing zone if they are already in the Microsoft Azure. But if they are not in Microsoft Azure, it's new for them, then you have to build a landing zone. So landing zone is nothing but where you are segregating your workload. For example, let's say you have for example, let's say this is your on-premise infrastructure. Okay. Now you wanted to migrate to Microsoft Azure cloud, or you wanted to build some servers or something in the Microsoft Azure cloud. So what are the things you require? So you require firewall, you require your VPN gateway to connect back and forth. And then if you wanted to deploy your if you wanted to host your VMs, etc., you need storage, you need VNet, you need Active Directory for joining the domain, etc., right? So this is where landing zone will come into picture. So landing zone, it will segregate the workload and the shared, there is something called platform and the application landing zone. Platform landing zone is nothing but it is a common components you use for your Azure workload. For example, let's say when you say Azure workload, right, that is not only for Citrix. For example, let's say this is your Citrix workload which you're going to deploy. Then there may be in another team is coming for SharePoint, and then another team is migrating their application, for example, core banking application. So you in the long run, you will end up in multiple workloads coming to the Azure, right? So you cannot put all the workload in a single subscription. So you have to segregate it, right? Why? Because the Citrix admin should not have access on the core banking. So the core banking guy should not have access on the SharePoint. Because if you are ended up putting everything in a single box, then there are chances of data loss or unauthorized access, etc. For example, let's say I'll just give an example. Let's say you are putting everything in a single subscription. For example, your Citrix workload here, your core banking is here, and your SharePoint is here, and some other workload also in the same thing. So now, A, the guy A, he is managing Citrix, the guy who is managing core banking is B, and the guy who is managing your SharePoint is C. So all the three guys are having access, full control. For example, let's say full control on this subscription. Okay. So for example, the Citrix admin. So let's say if we go and deploy a VM with the public IP, and now the VM is exposed to the internet. However, the core banking application, which is very sensitive, if get compromised, then you're kalas, you're gone, right? Because it is the main application which is holding all your customer details, card details, all those things, right? So if you somebody deploy a public IP address with a virtual machine, let's say this public IP exposed to internet and the credential got compromised, then attacker directly get into this virtual machine. From this virtual machine, he can easily get into the other infrastructure, whether it is a core banking or, and he can ultimately hack and he can lock down maybe ransomware or something else. And ultimately, you will end up in a disaster, right? So, in order to avoid this, you have to segregate your workloads across different subscription. For example, let's say your Citrix subscription should have only Citrix workload and only Citrix admin should have access on it. Your core banking, and just for uh, for example, let's say the core banking and similarly your some other workload like SharePoint or any other workload, it should have its own subscription. And the people should, or core banking IT team should manage their subscription, and here the SharePoint, they should manage their subscription. So somebody should not, like some Citrix guy should not have access on this, and the others should not have access on the Citrix. So this is where the landing zone concept comes. Okay, so you have to carefully identify and your host your workload in the Microsoft Azure cloud as a separate landing zones. So this is called landing zone. Okay, so landing zone is nothing but a place we are giving to the team to host their workloads. So when we're giving the place, for example, let's say we are giving the place to host Citrix virtual apps and desktop or Citrix whatever the workloads, we will set some policies here. For example, let's say Citrix typically doesn't need public IP, right? So we can set a policy that nobody should be able to deploy public IP address under Citrix subscription. So again, this policy is not set by Citrix admin. Okay, there will be a root level account. So where we are managing all these things. Okay, because if Citrix guy is defining that the policy should be blocked deploying public IP address, tomorrow he can modify that policy also, right? He can delete that policy and he can deploy it. So this is where the policy, the identity and access management all comes into place. So let's say I put a policy to this subscription saying that no public IP should be allowed in this particular subscription. Then any of the one Citrix team is managing this subscription cannot be able to deploy any VMs with the public IP address. Similarly, coming into the core banking. So in the core banking, I will mention that the first policy should be public IP should be blocked. And I will also add one more policy saying that any resource which is get deployed inside this core banking subscription, right, should be in UAE itself. It should not deployed in India or somewhere else. So such policy I can apply on this subscription level. This is related to the policy. And when it comes to access management, IAM, identity and access management, I can also set what are the users should have access on this subscription and what level of access they should need. Either they need read only, or they need only the contributor level, or only the virtual machine level, virtual machine related roles, etc. So all these things I can define. So these are all comes as part of the landing zone. Okay. So just to summarize, although it is a very big concept landing zone, but just to give an idea, so this is a set of principles, rules you have to take, you have to consider while deploying a infrastructure in the Microsoft Azure cloud. Okay. I hope it is clear. So now let's go to the next one. So when you deploy your landing zone, right? So it comes with all these things. So you have to create a tenant. We'll see what is tenant in detail. Then we need to have a Azure core subscription. So Azure core subscription, which I told, it will host all the common services. For example, let's say your Active Directory, it is a common service, right? So it will come in a core subscription. Then you have a firewall, right? Because firewall is the one it will control all the traffic in your Azure subscription. So that will come in a core subscription. Then you will have your VPNs that will come in a core subscription. Then we need to create a Citrix So in Citrix subscription, we will have only the Citrix related workloads, nothing else. So this is how you are segregating the workloads here in the Azure cloud. And then we need to have something called Citrix, create management groups. So I will explain this management group in the next slide because we have a dedicated slide for that. And then we need to have Citrix virtual network and subnets. So because in order to communicate each other in the cloud with other services, you need to have networks, right? You need to have your boundaries, and within that boundary, you have to have your subnets. Okay, so we'll talk about it in detail in the next slide. Okay. Similarly, we need to have the VPN gateway, or it is also called express route. So this is to communicate between your on-premise and Microsoft Azure. However, this is optional if you wanted to communicate between your on-premise. If you do not have any on-premise infrastructure, everything is in the cloud, then you don't need this one. And then the open firewall communication ports, etc., which I mentioned, what are the firewall ports you required, and then create a Azure resource group. This is again, resource group is nothing but a logical container for your workload that we'll talk about later. We have a dedicated slide for that. So once your landing zone is ready, so the once you complete your landing zone, so now you have all the prerequisites ready in the Microsoft Azure. Now you need to build your infrastructure, which is VMs. First thing you need to you need to install and configure your cloud connector, and then optional storefront, either you can deploy or either you can deploy Netscaler. It is purely optional for you. Then FAS. FAS is required if you are using other than Active Directory. Let's say if you're using any SAML based authentication such as Azure Active Directory, etc., then FAS is required. Certificate authority. This is again, if you are using FAS, it is required. And then IDS license server is required because if you are hosting XenApp, then IDS is required. Master image, you have to create your master image, either it is a server based or desktop based. So this all comes under the build phase. Okay, so once your landing zone is ready, next one you have to make sure all these things are ready. So once this is ready, then you have to go to the design and implement of profile solution, and then the Active Directory. What are the Active Directory details you need? Let's say what are the OUs you need, what are the group policies you need, what are the DNS records you need. All those things will come into picture over here. And then finally you download the Citrix software, that is a VDA software, etc., and the antivirus exclusion, etc., you have to apply it to make it perfect. There is no complication with your antivirus creating issue on the services. Okay, so before that, one important thing you have to consider, the setting up the availability zone of infrastructure, that I will talk about later, what is availability zones, etc.